Great. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Luisa Carmondayan. It's a pleasure to welcome to our international webinar, Concentration and Power in Food Systems, the Role of Antitrust. We are truly delighted to have colleagues from different regions and backgrounds joining us for a discussion that has been gaining increasing attention across scholarship, practice, and policy debates. Food systems play a central role in our economies and societies, and over the past years, a growing body of work in law, economics, political economy, and developmental studies has documented how these systems have become highly integrated, globally organized, and in many instances, significantly concentrated across different stages of production and distribution. These dynamics raise important questions about how economic power is structured within agri-food chains and how value, risks, and dependencies are distributed. Against this backdrop, today's conversation is not about starting something new, but rather about bringing together different strands of ongoing research and enforcement experiences to reflect on what these develops may mean for antitrust. Instead of assuming that current tools are insufficient, our aim is to examine critically and constructively whether the traditional frameworks we rely upon are fully equipped to capture the complexities of contemporary food markets, or whether adjustments, refinements, or complementary approaches may be needed. In this sense, our purpose this morning is not to draw definitive conclusions, but to open a space where evidence, comparative perspectives, and institutional experience can inform how we think about competition policy in a sector that is vital for both economic functioning and public welfare. In this sense, our purpose this morning is not to draw definitive, I'm sorry, um, the event is connected is to a research project developed collectively by Elisa Funari, Victor Döring, Miguel Freire, and myself, with the support of the Center on Multinational Corporations, SOMO. So the project examines a decade of CADE's merger cases involving different stages of the Brazilian food system from 2015 to 2025. The presentation that follows these opening remarks will introduce the scope and initial reflections of this work, without anticipating conclusions here in the opening. To guide today's conversation, we have brought together an exceptional team of speakers. Our first panel, moderated by Victor Döring, will explore how concentration, vertical integration, and governance across global food value chains shape power and coordination within the system. We are honored to have Judge Dennis Davis, Professor Tommaso Ferrando, and Professor Diogo Coutinho with us. Our second panel, moderated by Elisa Funari, turns to the antitrust practice and policy. Here, Commissioner Victor Fernandes from CAGI, Professor Amber Dar, and Professor Claudio Lombardi will discuss how competition law might engage with complex realities of contemporary food markets, considering both constraints and possibilities. We will close the event with the remarks of Miguel Freire. Um, Also, I would like to thank the Law and Public Policy Group, GDPP, at the University of São Paulo, and SOMO for supporting this initiative, and all of you for joining us today. With that, let us begin. I will now move to the opening presentation, where I briefly outline the findings of the research and set the stage for our discussion. So here is the PPT. If you have any trouble seeing, everyone can see the PowerPoint, I gather, yes? So I would like to actually change the screen I'm sharing just a second. Oh gosh, I believe it disconnected. No, I apologize for that. I'm really terrible with technologies, and I hear just Dennis laughing. I believe that's because he shares the same problems with me as I have. Here it is.
That's for sure.
So, as I said, to begin, I will offer a brief contextualization of why competition in food systems has become such a relevant topic for policy debates, including here in Brazil. So, food systems are composed of a series of vertically related markets that span from agricultural inputs such as seeds, agrochemicals, and fertilizers, all the way through production, storage, processing, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, and finally food services and consumers. In Brazil, the sector has particular economic and social significance. According to Embrapa, which is the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, in 2021, Brazil reached several global milestones. It was the world's largest exporter of soybeans, that means 91 million tons, the largest producer of corn beans, responsible for more than one third of global sugar production, and the leading global exporter of beef, which means 2.5 million tons. These numbers illustrate the structural centrality of agricultural and agri-food chains in the Brazilian economy. Um, next slide. So, moreover, when we move specifically to food manufacturing, ABIA, the Brazilian Food Industry Association, reports that the sector represented 10.7% of Brazil's GDP in 2024, making Brazil the largest exporter of processed food by volume in the world. At the same time, this particular sector illustrates a paradox that has become central to public policy in the country: the coexistence of hunger with rising levels of overweight and obesity. This reflects broader global dynamics in food systems, where the cost, quality, and availability of different types of food interact in complex ways with income distribution and nutritional outcomes. Even in countries where households devote a relatively small aggregate share of income of food, low income families spend a much higher proportion. This means that increases in food prices can have regressive effects, disproportionately affecting the poorest households, a concern that was highlighted by the OECD and echoed in recent global debates. Well, not surprisingly, the food sector has attracted growing attention from competition authorities around the world. Two developments in particular help explain this trend. Um, from The first one is the evolution of food prices from 2008. Commodity prices spiked to recent inflationary prices. The second is the percentage that large food retailers have gained significant bargaining power over upstream segments of the chain, raising questions not only about consumer prices, but also about the effects on suppliers, farmers, and processors. Much of this debate connects to the broader literature on concentration in agri-food value chains. Um, Studies across the US and the EU and emerging economies suggest that consolidation has increased in several stages of the chain. While not uniform across all markets, the literature consistently highlights three areas in particular. Well, the first one is upstream input industries such as fertilizers, agrochemicals, and seeds, which have undergone decades of consolidation and today are dominated by a few global players. The second one is global commodity traders, especially in the grain segment, where a very small number of multinational corporations have controlled a large share of international grain trading, shaping flows, standards, and bargaining dynamics across the entire chain. The third one, which is food retail, has experienced successive waves of consolidation. Today plays a central role in coordinating supply chains, with large supermarket chains exerting significant influence over suppliers, upstream. Well, this does not mean that all markets are uniformly concentrated, nor that concentration alone determines outcomes. But the evidence does point to sector wide patterns of consolidation that warrant close attention. This consolidation is relevant because it interacts with a wide range of dimensions, such as prices, including pass through of costs in retail and pricing power of input suppliers, economic inequality due to the imbalance of bargaining power in global food value chains, environmental impacts, which are driven by monocultures, technological lock-ins, and the geographic reallocation of polluting activities, and public health through the global expansion of ultra-processed foods and the erosion of more diverse local food systems. The causes of concentration are diverse: technological changes, government policies, global integration, and importantly, mergers and acquisitions. While concentration is not attributable to a single driver, the role of mergers is consistently highlighted across the literature, especially in the markets I've just mentioned. So, for these reasons, understanding how competition authorities analyze and decide merger cases in food sectors has become essential. It is precisely with this motivation that our research examined a decade of CADE's mergers decision involving different stages of the Brazilian food system from 2015 to 2025. In the next part of this presentation, I'll walk you through the main empirical findings of this analysis. So, before addressing this graphic and tables on screen, I would like to begin by giving an overview of the empirical survey we conducted. I would not get into methodological details because we don't have enough time for that, but only explain that using a list of keywords related to food and agribusiness, we carried out a research of merger cases using CADE's own jurisprudence database. Our initial idea was to gather all cases since the new Brazilian Competition Act was enacted, which was in 2011 and effective as of 2012. However, we found that because of the electronic information system called SAFE, which is the federal government's official platform for creating and managing documents and administrative proceedings, since this platform was implemented only in 2015, the cases from previous years are not as organized and compiled in the same ways as those from 2015 onwards. For this reason, our surveys cover 2015 through the most recent periods we were able to access, which is mid 2025. Well, after screening nearly 1,000 collected cases, we arrived at a total of 630 merger cases reviewed by CADE related to the food sector over the decade analyzed. The first thing that stands out is the evolution in the number of decisions. While the figures remain between 30 and 50 cases per year from 2015 to 2021, starting in 2022, this number nearly doubled, reaching 96 decisions in that year and 60 decisions already in the first half of 2025. Although we cannot pinpoint the exact reasons for this increase, it is interesting that it coincides with what Jennifer Clapp, a professor who studies the subject, identifies as the most recent global inflationary rate in the food sector, linked both to the impacts of COVID-19 and also to the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine. The jump in the number of cases can be seen more clearly in this graph in the left side of the screen. Next, this what we can observe is the number of cases by type of procedure. What we see here, as expected, is that fast-track cases, those which are analyzed through a simplified procedure, substantially exceed the number of cases reviewed under the ordinary procedure. Among all decisions, there is also a minority of cases not reviewed by the competition authority for not meeting the notification thresholds, such as turnover of the economic groups involved. Next graph, I'm sorry. So, in line with the literature pointing to globalization of the sector and the strong presence of multinational, it is relevant to note the high percentage of transactions involving at least one international player. In 65% of the cases analyzed, at least one of the notifying parties belonged to an international economic group. Um, the analysis of cases also reveals a certain balance among the segments involved in the mergers notified to CADE. Out of the total number of cases analyzed, 295 transactions involved relevant markets in the upstream segment, 249 involved the midstream segment, and 201 referred to the downstream segment. For clarification, this estimate counts every instance in which a segment appears. This means that if a single transaction involves more than one segment, all of them are taken into account, which is why the total exceeds the 630 mergers cases analyzed. Well, another point of interest in our analysis was understanding the evolution and percentage of transactions involving horizontal overlaps and vertical integrations. Verticalization is crucial to understanding how global value chains function, as well as how risks and gains are distributed within them. Although the literature often describes verticalization in food systems primarily through coordination promoted by leading firms, without necessarily involving mergers, vertical integration remains an important part of this process. When we analyze the data, and considering that a single transaction may involve both horizontal overlaps and vertical integration, we see that although horizontal overlaps are still prevalent, they present on average 68% of the cases. The number of vertical integration is also quite significant. They appear on average in 51% of cases, and in 2021 were present in 97% of cases. Um, let's move to the type of, sorry about that, I didn't present the graphic on time, but anyways. Moving to the type of decision, we see that CADE generally approves cases without conditions. Between 2015 and 2025, only 8 cases were approved with conditions, and only 1 case was actually blocked, compared to 608 unconditional approvals. That means that almost 97% of the cases were approved with unconditional clearing. Regarding the types of remedies applied, the data indicates that among the 8 merger cases approved with remedies, behavioral remedies were the most common, appearing either alone or combined with structural measures. Only 1 case involved a purely structural remedy. That means that out of 8 remedies included, at least 1 behavioral component was applied. Although the slight predominance of behavioral measures suggests that CADE often opts for conduct-based remedies, either alone or combined with structural divestitures, we can observe a certain balance in the types of remedies applied. That is, even though remedies appear in an only small number of the cases analyzed, CADE has demonstrated an appreciation for structural remedies, which are easier to implement and monitor, and also they are considered more effective and longer lasting. So finally, turning to the substantive elements of CADE analysis, we first observed that the HHI is rarely reported in fast-track proceedings and only moderately present in ordinary cases. Out of the 625 total merger reviews, HHI was provided or analyzed in only 18. The overwhelming majority of decisions, that is 607 cases, did not include any HHI information specifically within fast-track proceedings, where 535 cases were classified as non-applicable, which means the information was not available. The distribution indicates that market concentration metrics play a limited role in the simplified review track, while they appear somewhat more frequently in ordinary proceedings, though still a minority of cases. Overall, HHI reporting remains the exception rather than the rule in CAG's merger reviews. So, um, regarding the HHI variation, we see that this indicator is reported in only a minority of merger cases. Out of 630 filings, 486, the vast majority, provide no information on HHI variation, specifically within fast-track proceedings, which account for 467 of the non-available information cases. Among the cases that do not report variation, the majority fall into the category of increases of above 200 points, followed by increases below 200 points. Negative variations are extremely rare, with only 3 occurrences. What we see overall is that the analysis of HHI variation occurs almost exclusively in ordinary track cases, while fast track cases largely omit this metric. Well, turning finally to the substantive elements of CAG's analysis, and although I do not have a graph or table to illustrate this specifically, what we observe is that fast track cases review a clear pattern in CAG decision making. Most approvals rely on low market shares or minimal competitive effects, even when some degree of overlap or integration is present. In 286 cases, the authority approved the transactions exclusively on the basis of low market shares. In these cases, horizontal overlaps never exceeded 20%, and vertical integrations remain below 30%. An additional 49 cases combine the low market share rationale with other factors such as pre-existing integration, low HHI variation, captive demand, market rivalry, bargaining power, lack of exclusivity, or idle capacity. So, from everything that was presented here, I believe that we can arrive at the following key takeaways. First of all, is that if overlaps are under 20 and integration under 30%, transactions are usually approved with no major issues. If overlaps or integration exceed 20 or 30%, but remain 40%, below 40%, the analysis is usually based on HHI variation. In very few cases, argument beyond these, which I just presented, such as other arguments such as buyer power, countervailing power, bargaining power, etc., are used in antitrust analysis. The projected post-merger HI is rarely used compared to HHI variation. The C4 index did not appear in any case. Only 8 transactions out of 630 were approved with conditions, and only 1 transaction was blocked. Based on this, we have some tentative reflections and recommendations. First, well, we must acknowledge that CADE seems to apply its own rules, case law, and the Brazilian Competition Act consistently. However, in the context of the Brazilian food sector, and considering the role it plays in global value chains, some improvements might be worth considering including. The first one concerns thresholds, which are market share and HHI variation. Those thresholds might merit review for complex, integrated, and or internationalized chains. Second, buyer power, bargaining dynamics, and conglomerate effects could be more frequently incorporated, specifically in high integrated chains. Third, HHI and C4 appear underused, so more systematic use might be helpful. Fourth, in concentrated markets, assessing entry, rivalry, and efficiencies cumulatively may be appropriate. Fifth, repeated acquisitions in specific links, such as retail and slaughterhouses, could justify market studies, particularly in conjunction with other agencies and ministries. And finally, we see that remedies are rare. Greater use might be considered in certain scenarios. So this is all. Thank you very, very much for your patience. And I would also like to thank the rest of the team, not only for co-authoring this article with me, but also for helping me immensely in preparing this presentation. I believe that after that, we might move to the first panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luisa, for your presentation. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Victor During, and I'm a legal scholar. I have a PhD, a master's degree, and a bachelor's degree from the University of São Paulo Law School. And I have had the privilege of serving as one of the researchers involved with the study regarding global food value chains and antitrust law in Brazil, alongside my colleagues, Luisa Carmadayan, who you just heard from now, Elisa Funari, and Miguel Freire. It's my great pleasure to serve as moderator for today's first panel. This panel, named Power and Concentration in Food Systems, will follow up on the presentation that Luisa so aptly provided us to explore the ways in which different forms of concentration, vertical integration, and governance across global food value chains shape the distribution of power, value, and risk within food systems. By doing that, we intend to examine some ways in which economic power is structured and exercised within global food systems, as well as how this organization challenges some of the core assumptions of contemporary antitrust, particularly regarding how competition, market power, and welfare are defined and assessed. To allow for a very qualified debate, we're lucky enough to be joined by three world-class scholars and experts in the field, who I will naturally introduce as we go. As for the rules of the panel, which have been previously informed to all of our esteemed guests, each panelist will provide a 15-minute intervention to present their contributions and perspectives on the panel subject. After that, and depending on the time left, I will present a few questions to our guests so that we may take full intellectual advantage of this opportunity of dialogue. So now, with no further ado, I would like to invite Professor Diogo Rosenthal Coutinho to assume the lead and share his own perspective. Professor Diogo Coutinho is an associate professor of economic law and political economy here at the University of São Paulo. He has a PhD in economic law for the University of São Paulo, as well as a bachelor's degree, as well as a master's degree in regulation from the London School of Economics. He has also been founder and coordinator of the Law and Public Policy Group here at the University of São Paulo since 2007. So, Professor, without any further delays, you may have the floor.
Thank you, Victor. Can you listen to me? It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the organization. I'm gonna share my screen with you so that you can follow some of the ideas I'm gonna share today. Please let me know if you can see my presentation. Can you see my screen?
We can see your presentation, Professor.
Okay. I'm going to present some ideas that dialogue with things that Luisa has said and has discussed with you, because my presentation here draws on the same type of research concerning the type of antitrust analysis that the Brazilian authorities are being producing when it comes to food sector and food regulation and food antitrust policy in Brazil, in the food sector, in a very similar way that Luisa was arguing.
Luisa was arguing.
There is some echo here.
Yeah.
There is some echo here.
If someone has their phone open, their audio open, could you please shut it off? I think. Yes. Oh yes. Yeah. I think we're good. Thank you, Professor. Please go on.
Okay. So why does this discussion matter? Because of course that food systems are very key and essential for the social being, because food policy is a really important social policy in several countries, not only not only for developing countries, but also because the Brazilian Constitution provides for the right to food, and this is something that nowadays became a really concerning and pressing issue in Brazil, but also because this has been proving problematic in the Brazilian antitrust enforcement. Because to sum it up, the Brazilian Antitrust Authority very seldomly considers how markets work when it comes to food systems, when it scrutinizes antitrust cases in Brazil. The Brazilian Antitrust Authority usually fails in connecting antitrust policy with food policy. Of course, that these are two completely different mandates, topics, but it is somehow awkward, and it calls our attention the fact that antitrust in Brazil never dialogues, never mentions food regulation and the right to food. This could be subject to some criticism. This could be something that we could discuss. But at the same time, antitrust authorities are increasingly being challenged by social issues and sustainable protection issues. And at the end of the day, this type of environment, this type of conundrum, this type of context ends up confusing and challenging the type of orthodox antitrust approach usually adopted in jurisdictions worldwide, including the Brazilian one. So this, in other words, invites us to a more sophisticated, subtle, and contemporary discussion on the ends and the purpose of antitrust itself. But anyway, our findings, as Louise anticipated in her presentation, have to do with the fact that the Brazilian Antitrust Authority, namely CADE, tends to very narrowly apply neoclassic market analysis. CADE usually focus on antitrust overlaps and market shares instead of considering the global systemic markets and value chains in which those specific markets and market shares are embedded. CADE analyzes cartels per se, which is very common, but without discussing particularities and specific issues related to weak nodes and weak uh, players in those value chains that might be in a position or might need to some interaction in order to protect themselves from the economic power of the strong nodes in those chains. And also, Kaji underanalyzes vertical power and the bargaining dynamics within those value chains. So, this is the type of orthodox antitrust enforcement that neglects and disregards specific issues that could be widened and discussed more broadly if some sort of different antitrust approach uh, is otherwise adopted. In this sense, Kaji very rarely considers impacts on food prices. It rarely considers vulnerability of small producers and family producers in Brazil and in Latin America, more broadly speaking. It also doesn't take very seriously, let's put it like this, the concentration in upstream segments or sometimes in other parts of the value chains, in the sense that the value chain as a social and economic structure is very often disregarded. Because market share definition disconsiders this broader structure, and this also has effects on the outcomes resulting from the antitrust analysis. At the end of the day, this creates a problematic gap for antitrust analysis in Brazil. This takes us to a critical agenda on how to take global chains more seriously in antitrust policy worldwide, starting with the Brazilian discussion. The assumptions again are that the traditional antitrust often assumes that markets are clear-cut and separable instead of complex, vertically integrated in value chains and profoundly complex within those value chains. Because value chains economics are not considered, not discussed very deeply, although they are in some cases acknowledged. Because antitrust analysis not very frequently take into account the fact that competition happens not only among firms but also and very frequently within and among broad complete chains, what Lianos calls vertical competition, and because antitrust analysis tends to ignore that global value chains are home for buyer power abuses, value extraction, structural inequalities, and so on. So there is a there's an avenue of research and sophistication for antitrust analysis if those particular features that characterize and design value chains are considered, but this does not happen in Brazil. In another case law research in which we reviewed 68 cases, 47 of them were merger cases and 21 were conduct investigations, we found that in cartel cases in the food sector, the main conclusion was that the cartel existed or occasionally didn't exist, but there was no more there was no further discussion on the specificities of those types of cartels or collusions or dialogues within players, economic players in food sectors. The analysis heavily emphasizes material and isolated facts as opposed to systemic effects and systemic ecosystems or systemic structures. And merger cases heavily focus on market shares, entry analysis or barriers, and substitutability, with little attention paid to the competition within and between global chains. Across all cases, we found that CAGI often mentions and describes supply chains, but do not analyze them deeply, as I said before. There are some missing elements of analysis. For example, questions such as how mergers affect value distribution, the problem of vertical power and buyer dominance, and those there are listed in this presentation: externalities and chain wide price dynamics. And as a result, CAGI, as many other antitrust jurisdictions worldwide, fail to identify systemic risks to food markets and the right to food. This is not something that only affects the Brazilian Antitrust Authority, let me stress this, but also this is something that features and characterizes, I would say, antitrust enforcement as a rule. So what we have is the idea and the hypothesis that antitrust is not actually tailor-made, designed and tailor-made prepared and tailor-made applied to food systems as much as we would expect if the specific features and characteristics of food systems are to be considered and further analyzed in antitrust cases in food sectors. Some examples are these ones regarding the fertilizer sector mergers, the sugar export markets, and the lack of systemic analysis in global chains structures. But I do not have the time to go deeper on this. This is based on a paper that we can share with those who are interested afterwards. But those examples in those specific deep dives that we did during this research project confirm those assumptions and confirm those hypotheses that there is this analytical gap in antitrust enforcement in markets that are deeply related to the dynamics of food systems, which are in turn part of complex oligopolistic markets organized in value chains, as we all know. And this causes, to say the least, challenging problems and challenges the antitrust as a theory and antitrust as a paradigm nowadays. And this should be revisited. This is our claim in this paper. And I will stop here and look forward for conversations that we can have. And if necessary, I can clarify issues that we quickly presented here and share with you the presentation, the paper in which this presentation is based, on which this presentation is based. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Coutinho, for this very insightful contribution. I think that in your remarks, we have had some glances of the events research that you and the Law and Public Policy Group have conducted in the field of competition law and regulation food system in the last years, which has shed a lot of light on the subject and certainly gave a whole lot of context to many of of the data that we have presented in the beginning of this webinar. I would like to take further advantage of this dialogue and direct a question to you. I think we can stay at one question per guest for now, because in order to remain within our timetable. So my question would be this. In your presentation, you have repeatedly explored the notion that CAGI seems to be falling short of its institutional role when choosing to look at global food value chains with a greater focus on case-to-case antitrust analysis rather than a more systemic approach. I think if I'm overstating something or understating, please correct me. When I reflect on the viewpoint, I think about how much of modern antitrust and competition policy, not only in Brazil but worldwide, seems to have moved since Chicago, since the neoclassic references, to a framework that is not really that interested in taking a look at the whole picture and impacts of concentration, social rights, or anything other than consumer welfare, which is a reasonably hermetic concept. With that in mind, here's my question. Where do we begin to reform that? If law can be taken as a toolkit for public policy, this is a notion that I think you like very much to highlight. If law can be taken as a toolkit for public policy, how could we incorporate the GVC perspective in the current antitrust analysis toolkit at CADE's disposal? Is that even possible, or should we just replace our toolkit altogether?
Is this a question for me, Victor?
Yes, it is.
Well,
sorry,
okay.
Professor. Excuse me. Yes, it is a question to you.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that the way to start this, Victor, in a short answer, is to start improving and sophisticating and strengthening the type of case law that antitrust over the time builds and constructs. That means that not necessarily this type of analysis more focused on antitrust, on value chains, on antitrust, on food value chains and global value chains. That doesn't mean that this type of analysis require a formal change in the law. I think that antitrust is in most cases plastic enough to embrace those and tackle those kind of problems through its application instead of through formal changes. So I think that CAGI could, for instance, start developing some sort of criteria and method to better understand how policy systems work based on the really important assumption that food systems are very closely connected to healthy food. Food systems are very closely related to right to food, and therefore food systems are very much connected to human rights. And this is the type of antitrust connected to social policy that I think that could be applied without further changes in the law. As opposed to that, this could be the result of a more enlarged comprehension of what antitrust is and what antitrust is conceived to be. Of course, that this cannot end up as a complete change in the DNA of antitrust. Antitrust, in other words, should not turn into something different with the consequence of losing its grip, losing its ability to promote competition and foster competition and protect competition. Of course, that I'm not saying that antitrust should turn into industrial food policy, for instance. But I think that there is a middle term, a middle way for that, in the sense that antitrust can be more open to policy considerations and to regulatory, or at least not necessarily hardcore regulation considerations, but could be more focused on uh, topics and issues related to food policy regulation, even if that doesn't, if even if does, even if it translates into a dialogue with regulators instead of applying regulatory policy. So what CADI could do, or what antitrust authorities in general could do, is to engage in more close connections and dialogues with policymakers and regulators involved in food policy promotion and food policy regulation, so that antitrust could be more attentive and sensible and sensitive for those issues. That would be my take in a very quick answer. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Professor. That is certainly a lot of food for thoughts. And thank you again for this the opportunity for this wonderful dialogue. In following on, I would like to hand the word to Professor Tommaso Ferrando, who is an associate research professor at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Professor Ferrando, who has been a visiting fellow in the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard, the University of Cape Town, and our own University of São Paulo, holds a PhD in law from Sciences Po, and has developed cutting-edge research in the link between law and food, with particular attention to its international dimension and the implementation of local practices, including competition law, trade, and investment law. Professor Ferrando, good morning to you. Thank you for coming. If you may.
Thanks a lot, Victor, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, although it's a bit of an intimidating situation for me being speaking after such a valuable and rich presentation by Diogo, and being followed by Judge Dennis Davis, who definitely will be trashing my presentation if he has the chance, but I hope he will not. So I'll follow up on what Diogo actually was sharing, and I think it was a very valuable starting point on this critique of contemporary antitrust law and its limitations. But also, given my background, I would rather refrain from entering into the details of the normativity, of the legal analysis of what has been done, what has not been done, and I will leave it to people who are much more experts, and also CADIs in this meeting. So I will definitely refrain from that. And I will just share 4 points of interest that I hope will attract the attention of lawyers and also political economists and non-lawyers who are looking at food systems. And I think that what I'm trying to do is to say that the conversation definitely should happen within the realm of competition law and antitrust, but it should be expanded. So I've no doubt that the legislators and competition authorities may pay more attention to the specificity of food and the right to food, and the implication of concentration and horizontal agreements, and how that failure to a certain extent of antitrust law, if we can call it like that, is impacting the lives of millions and the planet. And I've no doubt that events like this one that we are part of today can help leveraging that plasticity of antitrust law that Diogo was talking about, and kind of promoting new interpretation or promoting legislative interventions that may make antitrust law and antitrust regimes more fit for purpose in the context of food systems and global food systems in particular. However, I think that the work of competition authorities must be embedded in a broader legal rethinking of the relationship between law and global value chains and global food systems. Otherwise, we may fall into multiple traps. And I think that one of the traps may be that need to transform everything into economic considerations, which is somehow just already happening with the conversation around sustainability and antitrust law, where social and environmental sustainability has to be translated into economic consideration, economic data, in order to be taken into account. I also think that we may think that a highly competitive or perfectly competitive food system is the solution to some of the problems that Diogo was addressing, unhealthy food or food insecurity or the lack of or the right to food, without maybe engaging with issues that collaboration, synergies, and partnerships may be the way towards a food system that is desired rather than fully competitive markets. And also, I think, and I will touch upon that if we merely focus on the technical data, so percentages, thresholds, and market shares, we may forget the power dynamics that are entrenched in the food system and in the food discussions, and that definitely also define the realm of possibility, that define what can be imagined as a future of food. So my hope, as I said, is to open up the conversation within and beyond what competition law is currently about, recognizing that the situations that we are discussing, so the issues with the social implications of market concentration, power concentration in food systems, but also the environmental implications of all of that, go beyond the boundaries of antitrust law. And so probably what is needed, or what I aspire to, or what I invite to, is a broader conversations that can really involve lawyers from different disciplines in order to try to understand how one set of legal tools may identify some pathways and some avenues, and some others may actually dismantle everything that is suggested. So briefly, 4 points, as I said, just a quick reflection on power and market concentration coming out of my recent experience at COP30 in Belém, because I also think that it's important to get a sense of the way in which convergence is happening between food conversations and climate conversations within the realm of public policies that may do the opposite of what we expect. And then I'll suggest that it would be important to also look into some specific areas that may be missing from the current analysis if we focus too much on market concentration as a corporate issue. And then I'll finalize by using the work of Michael Fakhri on the relationship between the right to food and concentration and competition law, in the hope that can expand and the number of people who will be interested in, so that this conversation is not just about competition lawyers and competition authorities. So very briefly, the first point on COP30 is just to bring to the table this idea that concentration is not just a matter of economic dynamics and threshold, as I said before, but it's really about the imagination of the possibility of future alternatives. So the COP30, as you all know, just happened in Belém, usually considered to be, or mostly considered to be, a climate event. For the first time in the history of the COP, there was a specific attention to food systems and to the role that food and food systems have in climate action and in addressing the problems of climate change and all over the world. And so what happened is that an agri-zone was established. And that agri-zone was supposed to identify alternatives, solutions, and pathways. And when you enter the agri-zone, you realize that those players, those corporations, those actors that are concentrating all the phases of the global food system, those that have been studied by Luis and her colleagues, those that have been studied by Diogo, that have been also encountered by Kadi and by Dennis Davis in their work, well, those corporations are those that are predominantly occupying those spaces. So those are those that are there to provide solutions about the future. So the first reflection is that, well, the concentration that we see within the food chains and those concentration that we see at different levels of the food system is mirrored in a concentration is those governance spaces like COP that should be there in order to provide alternatives or solutions or way forwards. And so we could take that as a matter of an intrusion. We could say, oh, the corporate capture of spaces of global governance. We could say that they are sneaking behind the door in order to enter into spaces of global governance. Actually, what is happening, I think, is that there is a whole set of public policies that is incentivizing that. A whole set of public policies that is saying there is not enough public resources, so we need the private sector, we need private capital in order to come and rescue us and invest resources, identify future plans. And so in a context of a very concentrated food system, when the public authorities look around and find for partners, they tend to look for those same partners that are concentrating the food system, that are accumulating resources, that are accumulating market shares, that are accumulating both in a horizontal way or vertically throughout the value chains, that are accumulating market shares and market power. So one first immediate consequence of that concentrated food system that we are increasingly seeing, on this transnationally and globally concentrated food system, is that if we think about alternatives, when the public thinks about alternatives, it falls into the trap of asking the solution to the same that are creating the problems. So yes, it's a matter of competition law and antitrust, of saying how can we break up the monopoly, how can we break up oligopolies, how can we reduce the power that certain actors are playing. But at the same time, that conversation has to happen with policymakers that are now willing to invest in the transition, that are willing to invest in different food systems, so that their decisions do not reproduce that kind of concentration. And so yes, antitrust authorities have something to do, but then there is a whole set of public policies, somehow in line with what Diogo was saying, that we need to consider. Otherwise, we may break up the oligopoly on the one hand, but on the other hand, we may just create the conditions for further concentration and further consolidation in the future. The second point, which I would like to just bring to the table as a matter of conversations and discussion, is that we do talk about corporate concentration, and I think it's very valuable. The work of Jenny Club and others is really highlighting how at all levels of the food system, when we think about this global capitalist transnational industrial food system, there are high levels of concentration, there are high level of concentration also nationally. What I think is less discussed, and this is something that my own research has been looking at, but I am definitely falling short vis-a-vis the latest updates, is that we do not spend enough attention, enough time from an antitrust perspective to the issue of financial consolidation and financial concentration. So yes, we see a lot of mergers and acquisitions. We see an increasing reduction on the numbers of players at all levels of the food system. If we were to look at financial ownership of those actors, we would probably see an even higher level of concentration. We would see that few asset managers, few pension funds, few investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, they would be present more or less in all potentially competing companies, and they would be present as significant investors throughout the chain vertically, even if on paper these are different corporations. And so that level of financial integration, the level of horizontal and vertical financial consolidation, is something that may not be fully grasped by the idea of corporate concentration. I think that we need to expand our understanding to financial concentration and ask ourselves whether antitrust law per se is capable and equipped with the tools that allow us to look at that. What are the implications? Well, one implication is about decision making and whether or not common financial ownerships across value chains and horizontally is such that corporate decisions are made in the name of maximization, which is one of the assumptions of competitions. The other point is that the increase in financial ownership horizontally and vertically intensifies the profit-led motive of the corporation, but also create situations that are potentially of concern, where being financially implicated at different nodes of the same value chain may make certain corporations responding to market signals in a way that is potentially not efficient, because another company where the same investors is invested may obtain a benefit out of that. And then, of course, like the increasing interest of financial actors, asset managers, and pension funds, and so on and so forth, in the food system is accelerating a lot of this concentration. So we see that a lot of the M&As that are happening and that have been happening recently are driven by financial interest and are driven by financial investors that really push for M&As because they see consolidation as an opportunity to extract more resources. So a recent case that has also been assessed by CADI, the Bunge Terra merger, for example. So three main players, financial players behind it. One was CPP Investments, which is one of the largest investors in private equity. British Columbia Investment Management Corporation, which is Canada's largest institutional investors. And then also Glencore, which is a mineral trader that decided to invest into an M&A, that decided to invest into that consolidation as a rentable and profitable activity. And so I think we need to move beyond corporate concentration and really start asking questions on the financial concentration and what can we do in dialogue also with the financial authorities and authorities that are looking at that part of our legal framework. Third point, very briefly, just following up on the Bunge Viterra, something that is central to the expansion of the global industrial and capitalist food system are infrastructures. And I know that the CADI in the Bunge Viterra has been thinking about it, and there have been studies like the recent document by the BRICS Institute that has been pointing at the role of infrastructures. I think that thinking in terms of food only as production or consumption without focusing on what happens in between, which is the circulation and the infrastructures that make that possible, is a shortcoming, is a limitation of our own understanding of the complexity of food. So really, let's focus on infrastructure and how infrastructures are increasingly consolidated. But then not only ask the question from an antitrust perspective, but let's ask a question from a public policy perspective. So which infrastructures are funded by development banks? Which infrastructure are funded by national banks? Which infrastructures are promoted by governments and by public policies? Because if you have public policies that promote infrastructures for export, for long distance trading, that promote the expansion of ports and railways and highways, inevitably, what these policies and the infrastructures are doing are calling more of those actors that are already concentrating the sector. When Brazil is promoting infrastructures to export more soja towards Peru or towards the ports in Santarém, by building a railway and so on and so forth, what they're saying is they're talking to the 4 main traders in the world that are concentrating 70% of the market and saying, here is an infrastructure that you can use. And so it's not only a matter of antitrust, the moment that the market is concentrated, it's also a matter of the public policies that are promoting that kind of infrastructure and that kind of vision of the food system that we should be addressing. And then the final point, and that's going to be very quick because I only have 1 minute, which is we can definitely have a human rights approach on all of that, and in particular a right to food approach on all of that. And in that sense, one of the latest reports by the current special rapporteur on the right to food, Michael Fakhri, is talking about competition law and human rights. And he started from a very clear assumption, which is when we talk about concentration of food system, it's not just about production, it's also about access, it's about dignity, it's about who can produce, who cannot produce, but it's also about the rights of workers, it's about the environment. So if we adopt a right-based approach, and if we were to integrate it, definitely that should be welcome, but it cannot only be about whether or not people eat or whether or not people have enough food. It should be about the right compliance of the entire food system, starting from access to the means of production, access to land, access to seeds, and so on and so forth. And in that sense, if we apply a human rights perspective, it has to go beyond competition law. And so to conclude, I know that it was a little bit scattered, and it's talking to competition lawyers by saying it's not just about competition law, but I think that what we are trying to address when we talk about concentration and consolidation is a structural problem that capitalism is leading to, which is more concentration, more power accumulation. And so as a structural problem, I believe that it should be a structural answer that definitely involves rethinking and reimagining and leveraging of the plasticity of competition law, but it has to go beyond. And as Michael Fakhri writes in his report, it has to do with corporate law, it has to do with contract law, it has to do with tax law, it has to do with trade, it has to do with business and human rights, financial law, intellectual property. All these areas have to come together and address concentration, market share, and power. Otherwise, whatever fix we try to implement will just be a temporary or partial solution that will not really address the structural problems that we are all concerned about. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Ferrando. That was, well, I think that's a very multifaceted and interesting contribution. I think as I did with Professor Coutinho, I would like to take a bit more of an advantage of your presence here and direct a question to you. I think in much of your work in the field, and I think perhaps in parts of your presentation as well, I think you hint at the notion that food systems should be viewed as a source of commons, not strictly as commodity. I actually, in a few moments, not here but elsewhere, you have defended the notion that we cannot tackle some of the current competition challenges and non-competition challenges as well in GFVCs without decommodifying food markets. I think you may have already outlined the general terms on why you think the current system is dysfunctional, but I would like to ask you, taking advantage of the way in which you talk about the need to incorporate rights logics in policy while dealing with the subject. I'd like to ask you, what would decommodified or commonized food system look like? How marching in that direction would enable us to better tackle the issues that you talked about? I see. I think you have outlined very efficiently your diagnostic, but when we talk about how things could be different, how different would they be? Why would they be? Excuse me. Why would they be different, and how different would they be if we took a stance of decommodifying food markets?
Thanks, Victor, for the question, for linking up with that part of my work. I think that would require probably a few days of intervention and many other people who have been actively engaging in a non-commodified food system. So there are many ways of tackling your question. I would start from one statement that sometimes we forget. Around 77% of the food that is produced globally doesn't cross borders. So the vast majority of the food that is produced is actually not for international trade, it's not for global value chains. When we talk about global value chains, we're talking about like a fraction of the food that is produced, and we know, and that's the work that Jen Clapp has been doing, we know that mostly what is traded is feed and is commodities like coffee and cocoa that are for industry and for transformation and for processing. So we know that the food system is much more than just trading, beef or trading soybeans. We know that what is feeding the people is actually not part of global value chains and is much more territorial than we can imagine. We also know that, depending on the statistics, around 60% of the food is produced by family farms. We know that who is feeding the planet is not Cargill, is not these big players. These are not those feeding the planet. Those feeding the planet are small-scale farmers, are family farmers, are territorial markets, are regional markets. Unfortunately, that 23% has an inherent interest in expanding. Why? Because they see food and food production and food systems as an opportunity for profit, and you generate profit either by expanding or by extracting more value on the basis of the same amount of products that you are producing. So that 23% is becoming bigger and bigger. And that's not only a matter of concentration, that's also a matter of public policies, that's a matter of international trade, that's a matter of investment policies, and so on and so forth. So these two words are seeing potentially food in a very different way. So for one word, the 23%, food is just like any other commodity. A spare part for a car or a cell phone doesn't differ that much from soybeans. So at the end of the day, what you do is that you produce it, you circulate it around the world, you allocate it to whoever is willing and capable of paying the most. So other people, maybe not the 70% of the world, but a good chunk of that, is seeing food as a completely different thing. Seeing food not as something that you just produce for maximization of profit and you circulate and distribute to whoever can pay the most, but it's something that is inherently connected with the territory, with culture, with biodiversity, with satisfying needs, with rights, with creating communities, with feeding people with dignity. So there are complete different visions. And so I cannot tell you exactly how a world based on a decommodified understanding of food may look like. And I think that a lot of people around the world are already living that world and are already experiencing it and are already promoting it. But what I can say is, if we think that food is just like any other commodity, I think that we are never going to be able to move away from that kind of understanding that it doesn't really matter what is produced, how it's produced, who is producing, who is eating, because food is just a tradable good. And so my fear with most of the conversations that have been happening around competition law, and I think that Diogo has been hinting at that, like the inherent limitations of not perceiving and understanding the specificity of food. A lot of the conversations that are happening within competition law that have been happening for the last 15 years that I've been following them are still incapable of going beyond. Why? Because competition law is based on commodities. Competition law is based on the idea that perfectly competitive markets are gonna deliver what is needed and what is desirable. So if we take it seriously to decommodify, we would have to ask ourselves the question of, can it be done from within competition law as it is today? And I think that the answer maybe not, but definitely that requires a much broader conversations about also the role of law in commodifying not only food but most of our experiences. So I would like just to leave it there in the sense of, if we think that food is just like any other commodity, and that planet is just like any other commodity, and labor is just like any other commodity, I think we will always find solutions that do not really escape the kind of multiple crises that we're experiencing. And if we want to get out of that, there is a lot of work to do, and there are so many bright minds in this event, and bright minds working with all of you, that I hope we can all get together and think about how it looks.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. Well, as with Professor Coutinho, I think that does give us a lot of thoughts. And well, I didn't expect you to get a strict policy recommendation, because we're not really in that sort of discussion. Well, I expected you to get a lot of provocations and indications on how we may think about reforming food systems, and I think you provide just that. So thank you very much. So finally, to provide a very qualified closure to this panel, we will now hear from the Honorable Judge Dennis Davis. Judge Dennis served at the South Africa High Court from 1998 to 2020, having also been Judge President of the South Africa Competition Appeal. He is currently an emeritus professor at the University of Cape Town, where he built his academic career, an institution from which he also holds both an honorary Doctor of Laws and a bachelor's degree, as well as an MPhil from Cambridge University. He would not really need much more introduction, because he has long been a renowned expert in the subject of power dynamics and global food value chains, examining their relations with financialization and competition policy. Judge Dennis, it's a real privilege to have you here. You may have the floor, sir.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And Tommaso may be surprised, but much of what he says actually is very helpful to what I want to talk about. I've been particularly influenced in this regard, and thank you very much for the invitation. I've been particularly influenced by the work that was done by a BRICS group, which then culminated in a very intensive seminar that we had at the University of Cape Town a couple of months ago, which concentrated on the question of the global grain trade. And it's from that particular prism that I just want to talk a bit, because it seemed to me that when one examined the manner in which the global grain trade operated, that raised profound questions as to what role, if any, competition law could have in curbing excessive power and essentially democratizing the supply of grain. And secondly, what the limitations of existing competition law is. And I endorse the point made by Tommaso that, of course, when one's dealing with this particular pathology, it is not possible to argue that competition law is the panacea, the solution to the entire problem. It manifestly isn't. But it does have something to say, or should, and it's the limitations of competition, or to a large degree, which I think are luminously illustrated by looking at the way in which the global grain trade operates. And of course, the key problem in relation to this area is that you have these major agricultural traders, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, LDC, etc. They really dominate the process. These are multinational corporations which essentially command the entire value chain when it comes to grain. And there's a clear link here between, on the one hand, the deep financialization which has taken place in these markets, and the interconnection between thus commodity trading and financial capital interlinkages between corporate groups operated by the traders. The result, of course, is particularly interesting because you can't just examine this particular market by looking at just the, as it were, the product being grain. You've got to also be able to examine the way in which the financialization of these markets have taken place, and which has spawned a range of sophisticated derivatives, which ultimately are interconnected with the entire process. And the result of this linkage between the deep financialization and the actual trading of grain has resulted by this, what they call the ABCD plus group, as having control over the entire value chain, together with those financial intermediaries who ultimately have turned the process of grain into another form of financial instrument. Now, of course, it's very important that we should be talking about it within the context of a seminar run through Brazil, because the BRICS countries lie at very much heart of the global food value chain, and there has been, right, consistently amongst the various authorities, calls for a global value chain-based approach to deal with the competition concerns here. Now, these concerns, therefore, if you're following what I'm saying, range from the financialization of food products to significant control over key infrastructure such as ports and logistics, which in turn then facilitate a range of practices which we competition lawyers would broadly call an abuse of dominance. And the point I'm therefore making is, how does one deal with this interconnection between what would be cognizable traditional competition questions and deep issues of financialization, whereby the actual grain itself becomes a financial instrument controlled, as it were, by traders who effectively, and very significantly, are making more money by the derivatives which are based upon the grain than on the grain itself. If you look at the financials of ABCD Plus, it turns out that between 70 to 90% of their revenue is derivative based as opposed to grain based. So I'm merely emphasizing just the complexity of dealing with this particular problem. It's various authorities have dealt so in different ways. So I found it interesting, for example, that the Chinese State Administration for Markets Regulation did in fact approve the Bunge-Viterra merger, but it imposed an obligation on the merging parties to promptly inform the state of global supply shortages and to ensure a stable supply nationally. So you can see that in relation to the question of mergers, there is the view that somewhere along the line, one is going to have to bring these organizations under control. And I found it really interesting, if I may say so, that the research that you did with regard to merger approvals, which replicates the fact that since 1990, the EU competition regulation have assessed more than 60 relevant merging cases involving commodity traders, only one of which has been refused. Only one of which has been refused. So the question is, you've got these huge corporations making vast sums of money through basically creating, together with financial intermediaries, a series of derivatives from which the prices of global grain is essentially predicated, which falls strictly outside of the control of competition authorities. And at the same time, you've got obviously what might be more cognizable competition concerns at the same time, which raises the complexity about this. And I'm particularly cognizant of the fact that raising these complex questions, which certainly it's taken me a hell of a long time to get my head around, is something where we could have a whole day or not or more just talking about these particular issues, and then having a look at the interface between competition law, financial regulation, and other forms of instrument or regulation which deal with the complexity of the problem. But even, as I say, within the standard repertoire of competition law, clearly merger regulations, which essentially have failed us in so many areas, particularly in the digital economy, have in fact failed in relation to commodity traders when it comes to the critical issues of grain. And it's certainly true that the regulation, which to some extent has had a look at mergers, has ignored the role of these extraordinarily large, powerful institutions, which I introduced my remarks to, as being financial intermediaries who derive most of their money therefrom. So then, of course, we have a further problem. And the further problem is that you can't use national regulation to deal with international financial markets of this kind, nor with global grain trading in this particular way. One has to deal with this in a manner in which a broader global competition set of regulations actually takes place. I'll give you an example of just how difficult this all is. So in South Africa, and not in this case of food, but in the case of a bank's cartel, where banks which had nothing to do with South Africa in the sense they had no presence there, no business or anything, simply because of the nature of internet, have allegedly conspired to fiddle the price of the rand to great detriment to the country. And the question which arose for decision was whether the South African authority would have any jurisdiction over corporations which were not located in South Africa, had no permanent presence there, and didn't acquiesce to the jurisdiction of the country. Now, we found that they did, by an extension, Competition Appeal Court, by an extension of jurisdiction. But it still raises the further point about the enforceability in relation to powerful institutions which are not traditionally or do not traditionally fall within the jurisdiction of one country. So what that raises is you can be innovative with regard to your own national laws with regard to jurisdiction, but what you can't do is essentially control a process of trading which is so deeply implicated with the financial system and which transcends national boundaries. You cannot do this through national regulation alone. Agreed. You could, as I've indicated, try, as the Chinese have done, to bring about certain conditions in relation to a merger. Agreed. You may want to bar a whole range of mergers which only reinforce the power of major agricultural traders. But at the end of the day, if we're talking about the fact that central to the whole process of food production is the grain trade, and central to that is the link between deep financialization and its interconnection to the actual trading of grain, it does therefore raise very profound questions as to, one, which legal instruments are appropriate to deal with them. Quite manifestly, it cannot only be competition law. To what extent can we start thinking through at least regional cooperation And obviously, in the case of why I mentioned BRICS, is because obviously the BRICS countries may well be in a better position to do that cooperatively. And thirdly, where can competition law actually play a role in the curbing of this extraordinary control over the entire food value chain, which is to the massive detriment of the vast majority of people who desperately require food. And so those really are my introductory remarks, which just, as it were, are an attempt to sort of think through what a roadmap would look like for various forms of regulation, including competition law, to deal with this particular pathology. And Victor, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Judge. Well, I think after this after this very nuanced contribution, I think there is I would like to proceed with one question which I plan to ask you ahead, and I think it makes a lot of sense with the presentation that you have given. I think that one of the main issues you have outlined specifically towards the end of your presentation is competition officers' ability of enforcing competition in consonance with social, human, environmental rights in a globalized world, especially when you look at developing countries. I think in that sense, South Africa and Brazil have a lot of common ground in terms of finding our own challenges and goals. Well, developing countries are notably disfavored when you look at how value is generated and captured in the context of global value chains, and especially in the food system. My question in this regard is this, and I guess that is kind of an open-ended question. So it's natural that we have open-ended answers. But is food sovereignty even possible in the wake of globalization? I think you have touched in this issue towards the end, but I think that you talk about BRICS, you talk about multilateralism, but I think the main issue is if we toughen up our competition policies to deal with concentration in food markets, but jurisdictions in developed countries where most of the most powerful players in food chains, which actually capture most of the value, if they do not attempt to make power brokers accountable over there, what are we left with? Can we make actual change just in the context of developing countries towards transnational multilateral cooperation in the context of South relations, or do we absolutely need to bring the global north along for the ride in order to actually go somewhere with this? I think that would be my main question.
Well, it raises, you raised the point that, of course, is a perennial in any debate amongst scholars like ourselves in an international context, which is the failure, of course, over a very long period for negotiations, particularly through the WTO, to have a serious competition protocol, which would ultimately have paralleled the trade component of international law, because you're quite right. If the figures suggest that the vast majority of the profits made by these huge corporations are derived from this way in which derivatives of food are constructed, and it's extremely difficult to kind of nail that down. You can't possibly do that through national regulation. This would have to require considerable international cooperation. It would have to drive us to some form of initiative, which all those years ago was mooted with regard to a proper competition protocol, which of course in the present world, and particularly under Donald Trump, is just so distant that one can only feel gloomy about this. But And there lies the problem. So the result of which is that if we are, and I mean, we've had a series of BRICS corporations stemming from 2015. There was one in Rio de Janeiro, if I'm right, in 2017, and about exactly global value chain cooperation. The best we can hope for in that regard is essentially to employ at least regional cooperation with regard to merger control and to the reinforcement of these traders who dominate the process. But if we are going to get to terms with the way in which prices are constructed and in the way in which the whole system, particularly the grain system, is controlled, then I'm afraid this requires international intervention in relation to the financialization, which is enormously complex. And the one thing I'm absolutely convinced about, having spoken to our own competition authorities in South Africa, is they have absolutely no basis by which they can deal with this. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the knowledge, and they don't have the jurisdiction. So I'm afraid you are driven to a broader terrain, which I suppose is a rather pessimistic way to answer your question.
So I think it comes with the turf that we have to actually rethink a lot of institutional designs and contexts in order to deal with these issues. So thank you.
Or at least we're
very much.
talking about it, which is important.
Yeah, yes. I think we have to start somewhere. But thank you very much,
Start somewhere.
Judge.
I agree with you. Pleasure.
Yes. Well, it's been a real pleasure to hear you, Judge. And well, I would like again to thank all three of our guests in this panel, Professor Joe Coutinho, Professor Tommaso Ferrando, and Judge Dennis, for generously taking the time, sharing some of your insightfulness and knowledge with us today. We're beyond the timetable, some sort, but I think that was well worth it considering the substance of our dialogues here. So in the interest of time, I will need to close this panel now and pass the floor to my colleague Elisa Funari, who will be in charge of panel 2, Antitrust Law, Policy, and Food Systems. Elisa, please. Sorry.
Thank you, Victor. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Well, first, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Elisa Funari. I'm a lawyer. We specialize in competition, antitrust law, and I have been participating in the study regarding global food value chains and the antitrust law in Brazil, along with Luisa, Victor, and Miguel. Following the topic of our webinar, our second panel will talk about how competition law and policy may be rethought to address the complex challenges posed by contemporary food markets, especially in the context of highly concentrated and integrated structure of global food value chains and the challenges that naturally come with it. As for the structure of the panel, each panelist will contribute with a 15-minute intervention to present their contribution and perspective on the panel's theme. Then, after we've heard from all three of them, and depending on the time left, I will ask our guests some questions. On this topic, we are lucky enough to be joined by a great and diversified panel of experienced professionals that I'm sure will be able to contribute a lot by sharing their knowledge and experience on the subject. Well, you have heard enough talking from me now, and with that said, I would like to invite Dr. Amber Dart to get us started. Professor Amber completed a PhD from University College London, UCL Laws, in 2018, in which she compared the diffusion of competition laws in India and Pakistan. She later extended her thesis to a discussion of diffusion of competition laws in 8 South Asian countries, in her monograph Competition Law in South Asia, published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. Presently, she teaches competition law at the University of Manchester and is also a senior research fellow at the UCL Center for Law, Economic and Society. Professor Dar is also a barrister at Lincoln's Inn and an advocate of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. She will now share with us her perspective on the relation of corporate power, human health, and antitrust. Can go, Dr. Amber.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Elisa. It It is a real pleasure to join this esteemed panel, and I've really enjoyed all the presentations so far and the rich discussion. I think mine comes by way of supplementing and supporting many of the discussions we've had already. I just want to begin by, of course, thanking the organizers for the kind invitation, and especially Louisa and Elisa for all the support in the run-up to the webinar. It's been much appreciated. So in my intervention today, I propose to explore three related issues. First, how the aggregation of corporate power in a single-minded pursuit of lower prices is directly and indirectly linked to health outcomes for consumers and other market players. I will look at, secondly, why this might be an antitrust problem. And thirdly, how antitrust or competition law may help address some of these issues. So, to demonstrate the direct and indirect health impacts of the aggregation of market power, I'm going to actually take you to a story. I don't have a presentation, but I hope you can imagine this with me. It's the story of Tyson Foods, which is a US company, was founded in 1935 as a one-man business of hauling chickens for local growers in Arkansas, and it grew to become one of the largest multi-brand meat processing companies in the US, and of course, as you know, the second largest company globally, second only, of course, to the Brazilian JBS. And whilst I'm talking about Tyson, I think you will recognize that a lot of its strategies echo throughout the food sector and in all of its upstream and downstream segments of the food value chain. So Tyson appears to have adopted a three-pronged strategy for aggregating market power: vertical integration, horizontal and conglomerate mergers, and vertical agreements. So as far as vertical integration is concerned, Tyson has integrated both upstream and downstream elements of its business into a single corporate enterprise. Upstream, it owns the feed mill, the slaughterhouse, and the hatchery. And downstream, it owns the trucking line, which speaks to the infrastructure point which has been raised, and of course the food processing plant where the raw meat is converted into ready-to-eat meals. There's no competition, obviously, amongst these vertically integrated entities, and the prices at which baby chicks are sold to farmers or at which grown chickens are sold back to the slaughterhouse are determined internally by Tyson. So there's no competition, there's no free market competition here. The horizontal and conglomerate mergers, which are the second sort of strategy for aggregating power, Tyson recognized early that getting bigger would help it survive. It would enjoy economies of scale as a big company, but also it would be able to withstand threats from competitors. One challenge that Tyson had was to expand without increasing its overall supply of chicken, which would drive down its prices, hence the conglomerate mergers. It has had various mergers over the last many decades. Key mergers that I want to just mention was a 2001 merger with IBP, which was the largest beef and second largest pork processor in the US, and this move made Tyson a global meat powerhouse. 2014, it acquired Hillshire Brands, which gave it access to various brands of meat in the country. 2017, Advanced Pure Foods, it moved into prepackaged food sector, and 2018, Keystone Foods, which which bolstered its supply to the global food service industry for chicken, beef, fish, and pork. So you can see it's everywhere. And finally, I just want to mention some vertical agreements, which was the third limb of the strategy for aggregating power. And these were vertical agreements that it entered into with many farmers, especially with poultry farmers, where it retained ownership in the chicken and feed that the birds ate. The farmers, of course, bore the cost of setting up the poultry farm, but often with credit from Tyson, which was also made available at rates fixed by Tyson. So that sort of speaks to the financialization, one part of the financialization of the value chains, and how the financialization is also internal to the food company. And Tyson, of course, had the right to cancel these agreements at any time. So that's what I have to say for the aggregation of power. But what about its impact then? So it had competition outcomes, but it also had health outcomes. So let's just look at quickly the competition outcomes. Vertical integration, horizontal mergers, and vertical agreements all enabled Tyson to keep its costs low, which resulted in lower prices for consumers. And we all know that's music to neoclassical price theorists. Of course, it's not known the extent to which Tyson was passing its cost savings to consumers, because it might be at monopolistic prices anyway at that time, but we don't really know what that was. There's no data available to me at the moment. Tyson's conglomerate mergers were allowed it to enter new markets. Perhaps it introduced some new products, but what it did certainly achieve was reduced choice, because Tyson's own product was standardized across these various segments, and the overall choice in the market was also reduced because Tyson had gotten rid of competitors. The health outcomes are actually much more dramatic. There was direct and indirect impact on health, and when I say health, broadly defined to include nutrition as well. So the direct impact was a degradation of quality that was sold to consumers. So in a bid to achieve economies of scale, Tyson was amongst the first companies to aggressively use growth drugs. And the growth drug it used specifically was called Zilmax, which caused cattle to put on weight much faster, but reduced the quality of beef. It also used antibiotic drugs without any regard to its impact on consumer health. Of course, there was no way for the consumer to know if this drug had been used, so there was no chance of them voting with their feet and actually, if another option was available, to actually move to that option. The indirect impact came through environmental impact. So Tyson created toxic waste, which damaged, of course, the environment. And a study spanning 2010 to 2014, Tyson was named as the second biggest polluter in the US, well on the way to becoming the first. And a 2024 report found that Tyson Foods had dumped millions of pounds of toxic pollutants directly into American rivers and lakes over the preceding 5 years, which threatened critical environmental ecosystems and endangered wildlife and human health. There was also an impact on farmers and farm laborers, because in order to drive its costs down, Tyson reduced the prices it paid to farmers for their produce. This made it difficult for farmers to meet their own food needs, and that's a right to food impact. And farmers were, of course, locked into exclusivity arrangements through these contract farming arrangements, and they could not sell their produce elsewhere for a higher price, so that option was not available to them. So that brings me to the second sort of limb of my discussion, that why should antitrust care? I think we've been alluding to it throughout the morning. And we've mentioned, of course, Michael Fakhri's work, but I want to take you back to 2000, when the Commission on Human Rights appointed Professor Olivier de Schutter as the first special rapporteur on the right to food, with a specific mandate to present recommendations on possible steps that may be taken to achieve the full realization of this right. And what is this right exactly? It has three limbs: availability of food, accessibility, which includes affordability, and adequacy, which of course relates to its nutritional value as well. So Professor de Schutter highlighted the significance of the structure of markets and concentration along successive segments of the food supply chain. He also noted that exploring the economic intricacies of markets in which food is bought and sold would guarantee a more effective implementation of the right to food. And that led to the thinking around the role of competition law in policy. So basically, the argument was food is bought and sold as a commodity. So any discussion about the right to food is not complete without recognizing that it is bought and sold in markets, and therefore market operations are relevant. His discussion is, of course, equally relevant for securing the right to health. And his approach has been echoed by the present Commissioner, Michael Fakhri, which Tommaso has referred to. So I will not repeat that. So what does that mean for antitrust? What are the issues with antitrust as it's currently practiced? Again, something that has been said already, the consumer welfare standard, as it's sort of the narrow price-focused interpretation, gets in the way. This means that if Tyson kept its prices low, competition authorities would not inquire into how these prices are arrived at. Now, some might argue that the discussion of fair competition, which is becoming so important, again, with relation to the digital sector, means that we should investigate how we arrived at these prices. But I think in relation to the food sector, these are still quite early discussions. And we have, of course, the Chicken of Tomorrow case, which said price hikes, have to be seen in relation, any kind of health or organic intervention has to be seen in relation to price hikes. Vertical agreements, again, here the consumer welfare focus meant that competition law was not too worried about vertical agreements. And even if they were thinking of the seller side, distribution side of the agreement, not the buyer side. Peter Carstensen has actually talked about this really well in his book, Competition Policy and the Control of Buyer Power. And he said that often the contracts with employees of the processor were such that they were absolutely comprehensive controls, and that treatment indeed makes the farmers more like serfs than traditional farmers. So quite a sort of damning indictment of these practices. And Tyson, as we know, has almost complete control on the livelihoods and destinies of chicken farmers. However, there's little modern competition law as with the sort of neoclassical focus can do about it unless we rethink some of these things. Vertical mergers and killer acquisitions. Again, Tyson has consolidated its market power by merging vertically with its input providers and distributors. It's not been a huge concern for competition authorities. Killer acquisitions have become a much more of a concern in innovation-led industries, but it's not considered in a traditional economy, even though here it might be argued that certain kinds of meats were put out of circulation because Tyson was going to promote its own brand. So what are the possible solutions? I mean, I'm coming to the end of the presentation. We've talked about elsewhere, Yanis Leonas and I have written about the holistic competition law. I now tend to think of it more as a rights-informed approach. And this approach would allow authorities to adopt a more broadly envisaged concept of consumer welfare, which is beyond price, and also, for instance, look to quality as a key indicator. I think the recent interest in sustainability, which again can be broadly defined to include food, and the sort of EU horizontal guidelines recognize the possibility of safe harbor for sustainability agreements, a possible exemption under Article 1013. I think that is an area which can be used to advance agreements on food related practices as well. As far as abuse of dominance cases, the digital economy makes us appreciate that competition authorities may be willing to take a broader view of consumer welfare rather than focusing exclusively on prices. For instance, they've looked at privacy degradation in the Bundeskartellamt Facebook WhatsApp merger, which is qualitative again, and I think this suggests that it is possible to bring in other qualitative concerns into competition analysis. So I think I'm really echoing something that Professor Cucino mentioned in response to the question asked to him, that we don't need a new competition law necessarily, but a competition law that understands the impact of the practices that it's investigating. Of course, the merger cases are also looking at new theories of harm, innovation theories of harm. So I think there's nothing to stop us suggesting some more theories of harm here that degrade human rights. What is really important, I think, is a sort of a separate track for cases which have an impact on, in our case, on the right to food or right to health. And this should be a signal for closer scrutiny rather than reliance on the usual metrics at which just traditional cases are reviewed. Where do we stand today? In December 22, the OECD Global Forum on Competition questioned whether competition law and policy needs to adapt as a policy instrument to better accommodate socioeconomic trends, such as the rising importance of sustainability. It asked two questions. They said, is the current consumer welfare focus sufficient? Or is the instrument of competition law enforcement still effective, or does it need to be complemented by other instruments or new legislation? And the consensus appeared at that time to be that the importance of social justice and socioeconomic rights notwithstanding, in pursuing these goals, competition authorities may not lose their focus on price-based ideas of consumer welfare. And we've seen this consensus echoed in Lina Khan's FTC as well, that what we don't want is a greenwashing, as it were, of potentially adverse price impact for consumers. We don't want greenwashing for sustainability reasons. We don't want greenwashing for food reasons. So I think, but there is room now for balancing these impacts against price and to arrive at a more informed decision. So that's all I have to say, and I hope I haven't run over, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Dar, for your stimulating and insightful contribution. Well, I would now like to hand things over to Dr. Claudio Lombardi, who is a lecturer at the University of Aberdeen School of Law, specializing in competition law and regulatory policy, with additional interests in comparative private law and legal ethics. His latest research delves into the use of empirical analysis, both quantitative and qualitative, to provide insights into competition law and enforcement. In addition to his academic career, Dr. Lombard has advised governments and international organizations on competition and regulatory issues. Professor Lombardo will share with us his perspective on the regulatory landscape in the EU and UK regarding concentration and power in food systems. He will then look primarily on the topic of litigation, mainly interest group litigation, and its potential in the context of highly concentrated food markets. Dr. Lombardi, it's with you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you very much for inviting me here today to speak at this really very captivating event, very brilliant event that has actually also surprised me because I've heard a few remarks and a few speeches, including particular the one of the just concluded, the one by Amber Dar. That were particularly interesting. So thank you very much. And I'm really honored to be here today. Not to mention, of course, panel one. If you allow me, I have prepared a very short presentation that I might be able to share with you. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Honestly, it's I shouldn't experiment with, there you go, with softwares that I'm not familiar with, but this time around I decided to use Google Slides for some reason. All right, so we have focused so far on important information that has been central in our discussion in both panels, which all focus on the issue of the concentration trends in the food and agricultural sectors around the world. So the many examples have been provided so far, and we know that anyway, in general, the trend has been highlighted also by my colleagues Tommaso Ferrando and Judge Davis and all the others, that there has been a concentration trend at different levels of the supply chain towards more concentrated markets. That facilitates, of course, also the abuses of this power that is accrued through in the market. And this has also been exacerbated by volatility in prices of commodities that, as we learned today, is also due not only to the power dynamics in this market, but also by the financializations of these commodities. So there is an additional dimension that we've added today. And the usual response to these trends is the one of regulating more these markets, which is not necessarily, I'm not criticizing it. I know that when scholars introduce the usual response is to criticize it. I'm not criticizing it this time around. I'm just introducing it to then present a complementary tool that has been perhaps underestimated so far. And for example, if we look at Europe, this response has been to, first and foremost, use Article 42 of the TFEU, that is part of the constitutional provisions of the European Union, that does allows the European lawmakers to introduce exceptions to the application of Articles 101 and 102, in particular with reference to the agricultural sector through the so-called Common Agricultural Policy, also the CAP policies. And these allowed indeed more recently the European Union legislator to introduce, for example, Article 210A through the CAP reform that creates, for example, a safe harbor for sustainability agreements, in particular in the agricultural sector. But we also have many here. I simplified these slides. We have many other pieces of regulation that address in particular the agri-food supply chain. Now, of course, these exemptions are not a blank check to basically do whatever they want, because of course we do have already case law, UCD and even the milk cases that have somewhat reinterpreted more narrowly these exceptions. However, the point is that the interventions so far have focused mostly on adapting the application of an interpretation of Article 101 in a way that allows the market stakeholders, in particular those that are less concentrated, in this case mostly farmers, to create more countervailing power and associate and get together to discuss both the main elements of competition, but also characteristics of their cooperation that goes beyond mere that goes beyond just the elements of competition. In this case, for example, sustainability. Additionally, we see that the policies have expanded beyond traditional antitrust, because there has been also the extension to and the approval of the new unfair trading practices directive that has opened up to the possibility of authorities around Europe to address several unfair trading practices, particularly those that are in the black and in the gray list. So there are a number of trading practices, particularly that do not necessarily relate to the price of goods, but the way in which these contracts are concluded, and the ways in which especially long-term contracts are managed by the parties that have a superior bargaining position in that particular situation. For example, by banning delays in payments, etc. But in that particular case, we have seen we haven't seen enough enforcement. This is probably due to the fact that captive parties, especially in the agricultural sector, tend to be very wary of using the supply contract that they utilize in order to sell their goods to claim any sort of remedy against their counterparty, because very often they are in a position of economic dependence towards their party. Instead, on the other hand, we've seen a resurgence in collusion, but also a surge in the activity of regulators and competition authorities. So that agriculture that has historically had a relatively low enforcement rate, generally speaking, somewhere below 2.5% of the cases, is seen a spike in activity, and in particular in Europe, both in total number of investigations, but especially in fines. You see, for example, the recent Mondelez case, but also the delivery cases. Now, though, there are some important and inner limitations in public enforcement. In particular, public regulators and competition authorities have structure and capacity constraints that they have to face no matter what. but they also prioritize cases based on their structural and capacity constraints. So much so that a case related to a small single farmer in a remote area of Scotland or Poland will probably not be prioritized, although it could be potentially an anti-competitive agreement, right? And their prioritization is very often also the result of a political compromise. In this case, private enforcement could be an effective complement to public enforcement. However, also here, we can observe a number of barriers to entry to justice that can be summarized into several groups. Perhaps we could divide them into cost barriers, technical barriers, and procedural barriers, behavioral and informational. Or if you want, you could have just three and say that there are important information asymmetries, but also there are important commercial risks that they have to face if they decide to exercise their rights, and there are enormous costs that come with it. For example, I have recently analyzed all the cases decided by the Competition Appeal Tribunal here in the UK, not only related to food, but in general, all the cases decided by the Competition Appeal Tribunal. These are more than 450, and I managed to draw several conclusions from this research. But the two probably more relevant for our discussion today are that the cost of an independent action are rarely below £1 million, only for claiming that, only for submitting a claim, and they can increase very easily. For collective actions, we are talking about probably 25%, 25 times more than this. 25 times more than this. What is even more important, when we are talking about small and medium enterprises, where most of the farmers were, the category in which most of the farmers were fall, then this should be covered by the fast track cases, which are instead very few. So to have real strategic litigation that brings that tries to protect the interest of a larger portion of society in a specific country, then of course we may want to rely instead on collective litigation. But as I said before, and this is quite promising. We've seen several examples of collective litigation in the US that has also tried to protect interests that go beyond the mere economic interest of the parties. But we started to see that also here in the UK, for example, in the case of Roberts versus Water Companies, that is a class action where they allege that pollution underreporting of water companies was an abuse of dominance. Now the court didn't exclude that. That is very important. However, the costs are a huge burden, as well as the problem in many countries of proving that there is an interest that is homogeneous enough within the group that justifies the representation of that particular collective action. Now, to conclude, legal mobilization is possible, And litigation is a vital complement to regulation. But there are certain limitations, in particular, as I said before, related to, in particular, procedural, cost-related limitations, and informational and behavioral limitations that certainly create barriers to access to justice that need to be discussed and need to be solved if we want public enforcement and private enforcement to be able together to solve not only the problem of compensation of damages that, by the way, in public enforcement is not covered, but also to advance these societal issues that we've discussed today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lombardi, for your enlightening and thoughtful contribution, particularly regarding how litigation could be used as a mechanism to help rebalance market power, fill the enforcement gap. Now, last but definitely not least, we will now hear from Commissioner Vitor Fernandes, who holds a PhD in commercial law from the University of São Paulo, a bachelor's degree in law and master's degree in law, state and constitution, both from the University of Brasilia. Commissioner Fernandes is a federal public servant and currently serves as a commissioner at the Brazilian Competition Authority, CADE. He is also a professor at the Brazilian Institute for Teaching, Development and Research, IDP, and director of the Center for Law, Government and Society in the same institute. The commissioner will share with us his perspective on the topic, especially based on his experience as a commissioner at CADE.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Can you hear me well? Okay. Thank you. So let me start by thanking Professor Diogo Coutinho and Elisa, and also Luisa Carmadayan for putting together such an engaging conversation. I'm really grateful for the invitation to be part of this. I also want to acknowledge the important work that the Law and Public Policy Group at the University of São Paulo has been doing in this space. So your research is exactly the kind of research and scholarship that we need right now in Brazil, and I had this opportunity to pinpoint that previously. So therefore, it's a great pleasure to be here with such a distinguished group of colleagues. I have some slides that I have prepared for today. They are very, very short. Let me try to share with you. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. So before beginning, I should only mention, make a very brief disclosure. I am currently serving as a commissioner at CADE Brazil, but the views I would like to share with you today are entirely on my own. So I'm speaking here in my personal capacity as a scholar and not necessarily on the behalf of the agency. Today, I wish to present some reflections on the challenges facing competition policy globally and food supply chain with focus, of course, on the Brazilian experience. And I will draw upon the Brazilian experience to illustrate some broader systemic concerns that merit attention from competition law scholars and practitioners alike. And I guess that some of these topics have already been touched by the panelists that talked before me. When we take a broader overview about the Brazilian landscape and the agriculture sector, it's fair to say that Brazil provides a compelling case study for examining these issues. So Brazil, as Luisa has mentioned some of the statistics before, but the Brazil's agribusiness sector accounts for approximately 22% of national GDP and represents 40% of the total exports in our country. And this figures Brazil as the third largest agriculture exporter globally. And the scale of Brazilian agriculture production is also very, very remarkable. Brazil controls 56% of the global soybean exports, accounting for half of all international soybean trade in the world. Annual exports reach 84% million tons, which is valued at approximately $30 billion in 2024. In 2023, Brazil surpassed the United States for the first time in over a century to become the world's leading corn exporter as well. And beyond grains, Brazil dominates several other agricultural commodity markets. So it leads exports of coffee, sugar, orange juice, and beef, while also maintaining some prominent positions in chicken and pork exportations. And given that, discussing competition and also um, the pitfalls of the more traditional antitrust analysis in Brazil is therefore crucial for the growth of the country and also for granting some more social developments in our jurisdiction. And when we look at the main vulnerabilities that the Brazil faces in this area, we can see that there are at least three main vulnerabilities in our food chain, and they are very important to be kept in mind by the competition authorities in general. So Brazil is highly dependent from some inputs, and more specifically on fertilizers requirements, and that definitely creates some substantial vulnerability in our supply chain. We are at most highly dependent from fertilizers from Russia, and we have saw this dependence to be very, very critical, especially after the Ukraine war, where it has been felt dramatically by the Brazilian producers. And also we are we see a high levels of concentration in the seed sector. So the seed market exhibits considerable concentration with 6 companies controlling over 70% of the market, including some major multinational biotechnology and agricultural chemical companies such as Bayer, Monsanto, Dow DuPont, and Chemshine Syngenta, and many others. And as we will discuss a little bit later, Kaji has revealed many mergers involving these companies over the last years. And third, the meat processing industry, which is an industry and a sector where Brazil is very strong globally, and it also demonstrates some substantial consolidation. And the top 4 firms control over 52% of the market, and led by the world's largest meat processor, which also is a Brazilian company. And when we put together all these vulnerabilities, it's possible to say that these structural features of the Brazilian agriculture provide some essential context for understanding the competition challenges that I will address now. When we look at the oligopolist architecture of the global traders, especially when we're talking about book grain trade, and I guess that Claudio and also Enver has mentioned that, and also in the last panel, people was discussing that. We can see that a small group of multinational commodity trading firms now commands approximately 70 to 80% of the global book grain trade. This is, of course, a remarkable concentration level, which places control over essential the whole food supply chains in very few hands. And the recent merger activity in this area has also further intensified this concentration. And we have mentioned it before, and I guess that in the last panel, some of the panelists have talked about that, and the largest transaction in the sector have expanded individual firm capacities to over 200 million tons annually. And this fundamentally reshapes the competitive landscapes that we are seeing in this area. And when we think about what are the main, I'm sorry, I have kept it some very important slides. But when we think about what are the critical regulatory gaps, and I guess that Professor Coutinho has mentioned some of them, I guess that a very interesting point for starting this conversation is the last reports from the BRICS Law and Central Policy, which was launched a few months ago, and it is called From Field to Future Report. And this report was presented by Alexei in some conference at the UCTAD forum. And also, I am today in Rio de Janeiro, and we will have this BRICS conference here as well, where we are going to discuss this very same topic and this very same report this afternoon. And in this report, the BRICS Law and Policy Center stands for 3 critical regulatory gaps, and I think that's a very interesting reference point to begin these discussions. So the first gap concerns the revenue asset disconnection, and I guess that's some of the panelists have also touched upon this before as well. But when we look at the traditional competition tools, we can see that they are particularly focused on markets where companies own some physical assets, and these assets are definitely important for their operations. However, when we are talking about the global commodity traders, they have involved it into a more complex dynamics of financial intermediation. And this completely changed the game when we are talking about market power here. For the largest trading firms, derivative-based revenue represents between 74 and 76% of their total revenues. So the logics of creating value and creating high levels of revenue here are completely dissociated from an owing physical asset. And this gives a very different perspective on how market definition should be assessed. And the second gap involves the network effects and market control. And here is the point where we see some literature, especially coming from Ioannis Llanos and Axel Yelanov, discussing that there may be new forms of market power that is being spreaded over the global food supply chain, especially via common ownership and some contractual relationships between the trader companies and the producers globally. So when we look at this perspective, the critical question is whether the decisive influence by these companies is exercised through contracts or through other means. And in commodity to trading, for instance, the influence over market outcomes occurs through securitization agreements, regulatory exemptions, information sharing, and also aligned incentives. Those are mechanisms that operate beyond the traditional ownership structures that we are used to see in the competition analysis. And finally, the third gap pertains to the post-merger integration, and competition authorities, I would say, evaluate transactions, but they often ignore their operational proposals. And I guess that Professor Coutinho has mentioned it, and how the competition authorities are falling short of assessing all the consequences of these mergers. And I guess that these 3 regulatory gaps that were highlighted in the report by the BRICS Law and Policy Center, they can be contrasted and then can be explained in some Brazilian concrete cases that we have reviewed over the last years. And when we look at this case, keeping in mind these 3 critical regulatory gaps, I guess that it becomes very clear how these gaps can be identified in practice. So now I'll turn to some Brazilian competition enforcement cases that illustrate these regulatory challenges. The first case is a very, very interesting case. And as Luisa has mentioned before, just to notice, between 2013 and 2023, agricultural mergers represented around 80% of all the transactions reviewed by the Brazilian Competition Authority, CADE, which approximately 500 retail mergers during the same period of time. So there is a great amount of merger activity in this area, and I guess that Luisa has made a very interesting survey on that. And I have just picked some very interesting cases, some pre-cases to discuss with you, and I know that we are a little bit ahead of our schedule here. So the first case, which might be the most relevant and interesting one, is the Sustainability Platform case. So in 2023, some of the trading companies like Cargill, Luiz Rayful, and IDM, they put together this joint venture to create a B2B software platform for standardization and sustainability metrics. And that was a very ambitious project because it was intended to gather all the data across the global food supply chain. So the platform aggregates some very diverse sustainability data, including production, location traceability, agricultural practice, water and energy use, chemical consumption, deforestation assessment, and also working conditions on smallholder farms. And firstly, Kaji has cleared this case, and just to make some caveat here, the fact that this case was reviewed by Kaji under the merger review process is that in Brazil we also review in an ex-ante perspective joint ventures. So even though they are not fully operational joint ventures as it occurs in the EU, so that's why the case was reviewed by Kaji. And Kaiji initially did clear this merger without any sort of conditions. And after a request by the tribunal, which, by the way, was very, very discussed back then, the Kaji's tribunal decided to review the decision that was took by the general superintendents. And then after a long discussions, Kaji has identified 5 primary competition risks and 5 primary antitrust risks in this deal. So first, Kaji has found that the members of this platform could deny access to rivals, therefore creating some entry barriers. And second, the platform could enable the exchange of commercially sensitive information between competitors. And third, the parties might create some new sustainability metrics and standards to exclude competitors. And to address all these concerns, the parties have eventually signed some antitrust protocol, which I would say is pretty much an antitrust remedy for this case, with some 5 binding commitments to ensure fair and non-discriminatory access to the platform, the prohibition on information exchange between competitors, and so on. This case was very interesting because I guess that was the first time that Kaji has dealt with the reality that the market power being exercised by the trading companies globally is pretty much about gathering a lot of data and gathering a lot of information across the several layers of the global supply chain. And I know that I will run up on this. And the second case is the Bunge Viteria merger that was reviewed across several competition authorities around the world. And in Kaji's perspective, Kaji has adopted a very traditional and a very conservative, I would say, perspective on that, and it eventually finds that the market shares and combined stayed well below 10% for soybeans for and other products, and the HHA index increased were minimal below 200 points. So therefore, there would be no competition concerns on that. And then the merger was eventually cleared without any sort of restrictions. And I guess that case highlights very interestingly how Kaji did not examine more complex features of the economic power, such as the financial relationships, the ecosystem dynamics that we can see in this global food supply chain. So just to a few concluding remarks, I guess that we have and have demonstrated that all the recent case experiences by Kaji emphasize some limitations of the current competition enforcement approach. The traditional merger analysis mainly focused on market shares and concentration indices may fall short to capture the ecosystem power that characterizes the modern global community trading. Competition policy, therefore, should, I would say, transcend its conventional focus on protecting rivalry in individual markets. It should instead prioritize, should give a greater look to some of the sustainable functions of the food market as critical infrastructure. And effective assessment requires, I would say, mapping actual counterparts network, looking at contractual relationships that create aligned incentives, and identifying some specific mechanisms of harm that go beyond the rise of price or the down pressure of outputs. And I think that gives to us a diagnosis that is pretty much aligned with the ideas that the panelists before me have put forward, that maybe we should look at the sector with a more nuanced perspective on how to identify new forms of harms. And I guess, just to finalize here, that the idea of ecosystem-based theories of harm that Kaji is putting forward in the digital sector more recently can be an interesting way to look to at this very same problem of a market power that maybe exhibits new features that go well beyond the control of prices and internal market when analyzed in isolation. So I guess that those are the observations that I would like to share. I'm sorry I have took more time than I would expect that. So, but thank you very much for having for this, and I get back the floor to Elisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Vitor, for your wise inputs and valid contribution with the discussion. We are running a bit behind schedule, 50 minutes past the schedule, but I would like to direct one question for each speaker, just not to miss the opportunity to discuss such valuable presentations. Said that, I would like to start with Professor Darn. Well, Professor Darn, as mentioned in your presentation and in your work in general, you recommend the competition law should evolve to a rights-informed approach, including its analysis, for example, human rights to food and health. In this context, how can we bring these elements to antitrust analysis and at the same time prevent antitrust from becoming overly case-specific or subjective?
Yes, thank you, Elisa, for that question. I do allude to that in my presentation already. I think that we are not suggesting, when I say we, I've worked on this with my co-author, Professor Yanis Leonos as well. I think the idea was not to move away from traditional competition law, but just to expand its vision, as it were. And I think that the times we are living in now, so it's been such a seismic change in the last 5 or 6 years as well when this paper was being conceived, there's now much more scope in traditional competition law to also open itself up to other priorities such as privacy or, more relevant to us, sustainability as well. So I think that what we need is some conversation, and we've started having this conversation today, but the conversation around, are we opening up the harm, or are we recognizing pro-competitive effects of potential agreements around preservation of food rights or promotion of food rights? And I think that's where the sustainability conversation has also found itself. Is it going to be a sword or a shield? I mean, to quote Julian Novak, who's done some work on this. I think that permitting companies to come together and coordinate their activities around sustainability or food-related organic sort of production, maybe conversations would not sort of catch them for cartelization under traditional competition law. I think that could be an important step. Recognizing, and I think I'm mentioning something that we've echoed quite often throughout this webinar, recognizing that food-related cases require a special treatment. So, for instance, in the EU, you have the Common Agricultural Policy, which takes care of a lot of food. It doesn't take food completely out of the competition realm, but I think it does intervene. But many other competition authorities, and especially even the US antitrust agencies, do not have a special dispensation for food-related items. So I think what we're not suggesting a case-by-case approach which dilutes the sort of technical tests of competition law, but more either a balancing exercise, recognition that this has a rights impact and therefore requires a balancing exercise, and also maybe a specific dispensation for food-related cases. Hopefully that will keep this quite sort of narrow, but recognize that food has impacts for health and the right to food itself, and therefore can't be treated just like any other market sector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amber. Also in an effort to bring these ideas into practice here, to move toward a more concrete operational antitrust application, I would like to direct my next question to Dr. Claudio Lombardi. Given your work on the concept of superior bargaining power in the global food value chains, that I think it links a lot with the role of group litigation in the counteracting of power of dominant players that you talk about. In what ways could competition authorities integrate insights from superior bargaining power concept and also group litigation to help redistribute power more fairly along the food supply chain, especially considering the intrinsic limitations of these instruments, especially with litigation, group litigation, as you were talking about.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Lisa, for this extremely important question that allows me to complete my presentation, basically, because I didn't have the chance to talk about superior bargaining power and abuse of superior bargaining power and abuse of economic dependence. These are, in theory and on the books, they are extremely important, but also in practice, extremely important provisions, because they allow, basically they facilitate the claim, both public antitrust enforcement claims, but also private enforcement claims, because they can be used in both venues. Because they basically, the antitrust authority or the claimant can dispense with providing a evidence of dominance, first and foremost, and abuse of dominance. The only thing that they have to prove is the existence of a specific type of relationship, namely economic dependence in some jurisdictions such as Italy, France, or to a certain extent Germany, or superior bargaining power in jurisdictions such as Japan and South Korea. Now, as you said, these might be subject to the same limitations of most of the other types of litigation that I described before during my presentation, namely that a single farmer, for instance, might find it complex to engage in litigation, even litigation that is being simplified vis-a-vis abuse of dominance under the special provisions that regulate abuse of superior bargaining positions. And in this case, collective actions can be extremely helpful, and they can be used in most of these jurisdictions. Collective actions can be used. But before I go there, I would like just to highlight one important development in the use of abuse of superior bargaining power provisions, which though relates to the digital sector. So, for example, in countries such as Italy and France, abuse of economic dependence has been updated, in particular in the digital sector, so that there is a presumption, a rebuttable presumption of existence of a situation of technological or economic dependence if the counterparty is a gatekeeper. Now, this has been introduced exactly because of the sweeping powers of these gatekeepers, and also the statistical evidence that supports the presumption that many of them adopt several the UTPs that were blacklisted or graylisted in the EU law. Now, the same analysis in theory could be done also in other markets, but we don't have it. Thus, we don't have these rebuttable presumptions present also in other markets, such as the food market. So the digital market has received enormous attention for many reasons, but I believe that the same analysis could be replicated in other markets, and perhaps we would find very similar results there. Now, going back, and I will conclude in a minute, to group litigation, one of the main and collective actions, one of the main hurdles here to overcome is that not all these jurisdictions allow for an opt-out litigation, for collective litigation on an opt-out basis, which is fundamental in this kind of group litigations, because very often, due to the captive relationship that I was describing before and the economic dependence that exists by definition, there is a well-documented fear factor whereby the captive party is very wary of engaging into start litigating a case against their counterparty. Thus, in this case, as sector associations and groups that are created ad hoc for collective litigations are fundamental, and in particular the opt-out options allows them to act more swiftly and to cover a bigger portion of that particular interest group. Thank you very much. And then there would be much more to say, but I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lombardi. And now for my last question, I'd like to call on Commissioner Fernandes. I think it goes with your presentation, and maybe it's going to be just a continuation, but in relation to Brazil's food supply chain, I want you to talk a little bit more about how CADE is adapting its enforcement approach to address competition issues in the sector, and what unique challenges does such a concentrated and especially highly integrated market structure pose for antitrust policy? And also, if you see any space for integrate not only a new theory of harms that I think that you'll talk a little bit about, but also maybe review the usual thresholds, market share and HHI thresholds that we use as safeguards, as they might not be sufficient to identify and face the real concentration issue in this complex integrated chains. Here, just for context, as Luisa was saying, in our one of the finds of our work consisted in realizing that out of the 630 cases analyzed, only 23 involved combined market shares really high, and high here is above 40%. So it's not it's not really far from this safe harbors we have, though 12% for overlaps and 30% of for vertical integrations. So my question goes in the sense that if this is really sufficient to identify and face the problem of concentration in these complex structures of global value chains. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I would say that there are two broader obstacles into integrating a more comprehensive competition policy enforcement, not only in the agriculture value chain sector, but as a whole. And the first one is that in Brazil, I guess there is this very, very intensive fixation with market shares as a metric of market power. And maybe that comes from the fact that our Brazilian Competition Act specifically sets some market share threshold as a presumption of market power, and that could eventually drive to the misunderstanding that market power is about market shares, which we know it is not. And when we see that in the merger review in the agribusiness sector, many of the arguments that the parties put forward are strictly based on market shares, on the lower market shares thresholds, because the markets are very, very broadly defined. And we see that's a huge point of concern. And I guess that the experiences that CADE has been gathering in the digital sector may be a relevant one and point out that market power and economic power can be, to mention one of the articles of Professor Llanos, it can be a coat of many colors. There can be other features and other levels of market power that go well beyond market shares. And secondly, I guess there is a huge taboo in Brazil, in the Brazilian competition law community, which is putting forward theories of harm that go beyond exclusion. And I guess that it comes from our historical perspective due to the fact that during the 90s, the Brazilian Competition Authority has walked away from the discussion of the control of price levels in Brazil. And then people eventually thought that being open to discuss non-exclusion theories of harm is to go to price level controls. And therefore, the Brazilian competition community as a whole has walked away from exploitative abuses, theories of harm. And I guess that is very difficult to overcome these days. But when we look once again to the experience in the digital sector, CADE might be opening itself. And when we look to the Brazilian Apple case, for instance, to consider other forms of abuse of dependence, as Claudio has mentioned before, that could be somehow translated to the global food supply chains through broader discussions on the abuse of economic dependence or the abuse of power, buying power, and this across these layers. So I guess those are the two huge taboos that we have in Brazil.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Fernandes. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so I will now have to bring this wonderful discussion to a close. First, I would like to express my gratitude to our speakers for accepting the challenge and taking the time to participate in the event. I also thank all the audience for your time and interest. And I really hope the discussion goes beyond the boundaries of this event. Thank you all. I now hand things over to my colleague Miguel, who will close the webinar.
Thank you, Elisa. My name is Miguel Freire. I'm also a researcher and co-author in the article that Luisa presented earlier. I would just like to say a few very quick concluding words. First, I would also, again, like to thank everyone in attendance and especially our panelists. We were already expecting a highly qualified discussion from such distinguished speakers, but I think I speak for everyone when I say that all the presentations were truly engaging and thought-provoking. I'd also like to thank Professor Coutinho and the GDPP Research Group from the University of São Paulo for their support in making this webinar happen, as well as the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations for their support and generous funding of this project, both the article and this webinar. Finally, I would like to thank my colleagues and co-organizers, Luisa, Victor, and Elisa, for all your contributions and teamwork. And it's been an honor and a pleasure working with you. And yeah, with that, I think we can wrap things up. Thank you all once again for being here and for engaging with us. And we hope to continue this conversation soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.